All right, welcome to our free GMAT prep hour for October 10th, 2023. I'm Dmitry, and I'm going to be talking to you about critical reasoning today. Specifically, I'm going to talk about this idea of predicting the something else that we might have a hard time predicting. One of the most common things I hear people tell me about critical reasoning, maybe about verbal in general, is I don't know how to think of the answers. And I don't recognize them when I see them. And teachers will often say, well, predict. And I'm going to talk about prediction today. But I want to talk about loose prediction because sometimes I think people figure, well, I'm just supposed to be so brilliant that I thought of this exact answer and I knew in advance that it was coming. And it's not about that. In one sense, to me, it's like predicting a plot twist in a story that you're reading or watching. Maybe you didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but you knew the kind of thing to expect, or you knew that everything wasn't what it seemed. And I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of loose predictions, where we're saying this argument isn't perfect. I can see some ways that it could go wrong, and here's how I'm going to brainstorm potential objections you can make. And we'll use that to mostly weaken the argument. But we'll see a few different question types today. So I'm going to focus mostly on questions that ask you to weaken the argument, because that's where it's the most clear that we're finding a weakness or something that would ruin the argument. But we can apply that to other types of question like assumption, evaluate, strengthen, and there's a lot of commonalities between them. And of course, to do this, we're going to have to work through the answer choices. So we'll work on how to better um, spot a good answer and how to better eliminate bad answers and kind of let those work together in a nice, smooth process. So what I want to do mostly is start with just question stems or arguments, with the idea being that I really want to understand what I've been given before I worry about looking at the answer choices. And I would say most people in verbal look at the answer choices too soon. And I think that's a real source of danger when you're doing these. If you're leaping to the answer choices without really knowing what you're looking for, it's really hard to know when you found the answer, and it's really easy to fall prey to traps. So let me give you a question that's a little different than most of the ones we're going to do today. I always start assuming that I'm not in a class where the teacher's hiding it. If I'm taking the test, I always start with the question. So this question asks, which of the following pieces of evidence, if true, would provide the best explanation for the apparent discrepancy? And so this is a discrepancy question. The basic idea with these is we're saying um, there's something weird here. What would explain it? And this is a type that you won't see a ton of. They do show up. It's not the most common type that you'll see, but I think it has some relevance to the other types of questions that we'll do today. So let's take a minute to think about this one and what could be going on. We have a poll that says 71% of respondents cast votes in the most recent national election. But then we look at voting records and we see only 60% of eligible voters actually voted. And we're supposed to figure out which of the answers could explain this. So I kind of want to think about, well, what could possibly explain it? First, I want to know what's weird. Sometimes that's not clear. I think here we have a numerical discrepancy. The numbers don't match up. The percentage of people who voted doesn't match the percentage of people who said they voted. So why might that be? So curious for your ideas. Why might these numbers not match up? Any ideas? Okay, military voters overseas. All right, cool. So there could be something in terms of a particular group of voters. Now, what would it be about military voters that would make these numbers not match? In other words, why would military voters cause this discrepancy? Depending on how we look at it, it could be a reason that it could be an explanation, or it could even make it more mysterious. Oh, so maybe there's a difference between the eligibility groups, right? So one way to think of this is that the poll was, we asked people whether they voted, right? And then the records said 60% of those eligible voted. So we've got some possibilities here. One is that there could be, so if we ask why these didn't match up, there could be a difference in the groups. For instance, maybe we only polled people stateside, but there are many eligible voters overseas who did not vote, right? Notice this would only matter if there was a difference in voting rate, right? If I've got a bunch of people in the service who are stationed overseas and they all vote, and let's say 60% of them vote too, then that doesn't explain the discrepancy, because you'd still say, all right, but we still have more people at home saying they're voting than there really were. And if, let's say, everyone in the service voted, right, or 80, 90, 100%, then this would just be even weirder. We'd say, well, it's not the overseas folks, because those people actually are voting a lot. And so where is this loss coming from? So one possibility is that there's some difference in, like, maybe we're not counting correctly the different groups, right? It could also have to do with the size of the groups, right? Maybe almost everyone is eligible. Let me say this better. That's not a good way to say it. Not maybe almost everyone is eligible, but maybe there's a difference in size between eligible voters and non-eligible voters, right? So maybe 60% of eligible voters voted. No, that's not going to work, right? That would only work if there was like a drop off in who said they voted, because there's some people who aren't eligible, right? If 60% of eligible voters voted, where could another 10% of people come from? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, so I can't do that. And so what I'm showing is I have to brainstorm, and I may run out of ideas at some point. But what I'm trying to think of is, how could these be different? At the most naive, I'll just say, well, they can't be. Those are this, that's impossible. Or if I'm trying to weaken an argument, I'll say you can't. It's a perfect argument. Right? So if I say, my doctor recommended this pill, so it's the best pill, well, it sounds good, right? And if I trust my doctor, then sure, maybe it is. But there's that slight difference. Is the pill your doctor recommends the same as the best pill? Do I always assume those are the same? So here I know they can't be the same. There is a discrepancy. The percentage of eligible voters that voted doesn't match the percentage of people who said they voted. So for some reason, there's some difference. So it might have to do with the size of the groups. It might have to do with how I'm counting or what I'm looking at. It's not just going to be a flat out error, because then we wouldn't believe the premises, and we're supposed to believe the premises. We're saying all this stuff is true. So it has to be some reason that even though this is true, that it makes sense for the numbers not to match up. Well, let's see what we can find in the answers. And we want to get in the habit of trying the best we can to predict, but at the same time, not getting hung up on predicting for 4 minutes, because this whole process is supposed to be over and done within 2 minutes. We read it, we predict, we look at the answers, we pick one, we move on. 2 minutes. Okay, so let's see what we got. I'm going to give you a poll to poll in your answer, and then we'll try this out. But take a minute to look this over. Okay, we're pretty divided on this answer. Let's see if we can get a little bit more clarity about what matters here. Didn't see a lot of love for A. A is the kind of thing that someone might be tempted by because they might just think, yeah, well, maybe the numbers are just wrong. But we're not worried so much about the numbers being wrong. And in this case, sure, a margin of error could be relevant, but a margin of error of plus or minus 5 doesn't really tell us much, because then that would still say that in the survey, it would be somewhere between what, 66 and 76%, assuming they mean 5 percentage points out of the voters, right? 66 to 76% of people said they voted, but only 60% did vote. So they'd still have a discrepancy. So A doesn't really eliminate the discrepancy that we see. Now, a lot of people are drawn to B, which is about living overseas. And we did talk about, hey, what about people in the service who vote from overseas? The problem is this doesn't explain why there's a difference between how many people said they voted and how many people did vote, right? If I didn't poll the people who are overseas, then if anything, I should see more. I should see, 70% of people said that they voted, but actually, 80 or 85% of people actually did vote, right? I should see the discrepancy going the other way. So just the fact that people live overseas doesn't tell me why there's this difference between who said they voted and who actually voted. Okay. So it leaves us with C, D, and E. And I talked earlier about how we can efficiently work the answers. I think one thing that's really useful is to think about doing a first pass and a second pass. And we won't always do this perfectly, of course. We might eliminate the right answer on our first pass. But what we're trying to do is start with a fairly loose filter where we're just saying, all right, let me only get rid of things that I know don't do what I want, that go the opposite way, or that just don't really have much relevance. And then I'll come back around and reassess the others. Sometimes I'm too tight on my filter the first time and I get rid of all the answers. So then I have to go back and say, okay, I was being too picky. What am I really looking for? Let me clarify my task for one thing, and let me make sure that I'm just a little bit more open to some oddball answers. And that's why the theme of today is something else. There's often just something else we didn't think of, and we have to think which of these would matter. So let's look at these one at a time and see how they might matter. C says that prior research has shown that people who actually do vote are also more likely to respond to polls than those who do not vote. So what does this have to do with anything if we say that people who vote are more likely to respond to polls? Could that have any influence on this discrepancy or on these numbers? Maybe not 100% clear. Let's sit on that one. How about D? Many people who intend to vote are prevented from doing so by last-minute conflicts on election day or other complications. Well, I can totally see how I might say I'm going to vote, but then I don't. So does that explain why more people said that they did vote than actually voted? Wait a second. This isn't about who said they would vote, it's who said they did vote. Can we see that? So careful, if you chose D, you're addressing a slightly different question than we have here, right? The discrepancy is that 71% said that they voted, right? But only 60% actually did vote. So there's a difference between what we see in the poll and what actually happened. And it's not about predicting whether you would vote, right? I get it if you thought you were going to vote and you got hit by a car that day. Hey, no judgment. But this is different. This is you didn't vote, but then you said you did, right? So one possibility is, did they lie? And that's something we didn't talk about, but that's certainly a possibility. Maybe when you ask me if I voted, I don't want to say that I didn't. So I'm like, yeah, I totally, yep, voted, right? So maybe it's just that there's a chunk of about 10% of eligible voters who don't want to admit they didn't vote. So they say they did, and that inflates the numbers. Right. And we've seen that with polling. The same thing with when people say who they voted for. People aren't always honest about who they voted for. Maybe they don't want to say who they voted for, or they don't want to admit, or they change who they voted for, even though that's not what actually happened. We could see that. Doesn't end up being in one of the answer choices, but we could have predicted that. E says some people confuse the national election with other recent elections when responding to the poll. Okay. So that's interesting. This is saying more people said they voted than did. Maybe they were just confused. That's a possibility. Maybe they didn't lie. Maybe they were just confused or wrong. Right? And that could be like a lot of things. Maybe I think that I am entitled to some tax write-off, and so I take it, and it's not that I'm trying to commit tax fraud. I really thought that I could take that tax write-off, and I was wrong. Or I said that I saw a movie because I mixed it up with another movie, and I haven't seen that movie, but I wasn't lying. Okay, so E makes some sense. Um, let's just dig back in and make sure we're cool with eliminating C then. C is saying that people who vote are more likely to respond to polls. Let's take a minute and see what would happen if that were true. If voters are the ones who pick up the phone and non-voters, for whatever reason, don't pick up the phone, what's going to happen when I take my poll? Who am I going to end up talking to? I'm going to get the skewed results of people who voted, right? And this is a really common pattern that you'll see in all kinds of questions, which is selection bias, right? The surveyed group is not the same as just a random sampling of all voters. Okay. Think about something very, very partisan for a second, right? Let's say you're, I don't know, you're a Democrat and you go to the Democratic convention and talk to people at the Democratic convention and you ask them, hey, are you going to vote for a Democrat or a Republican in the next election? And they almost all say Democrat, 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 Democrat. And then you say, aha, so Democrats are going to sweep the election. Well, obviously that wouldn't make any sense because you're only talking to people at a Democratic convention. There aren't very many Republicans, if any, there. And therefore, you're going to see a ton of support for Democrats. You would never use that to predict the election. You might use it to predict which Democrat's going to get the nomination or how Democrats feel about the issues or how motivated Democrats are to vote, but you wouldn't be able to use it to determine the outcome of the election. And everyone would know that. No one would think that you could, right? You could have a more subtle thing, though. Maybe I go someplace like a supermarket or a sports event and I ask people what they're going to vote for. And I think, oh, that's going to be a better sample of the population. But if there's even a little bit of bias or skew in the sample of who goes to that place, right? Maybe it's a grocery store where that's more popular with Republicans than Democrats, or a sporting team that has a lot of Democratic fans, or whatever it is, right? Then I might not be getting a random sample of the public. Maybe it simply has to do with age, right? Maybe older people skew one way and younger people skew another, and the group I'm getting is not a representative sample of the population in terms of age, gender, income, location, whatever it is, right? So there's all these forms of selection bias. But a really common one has to do with people's self-selection, the kind of people who want to participate in a group, who want to take a survey, who want to answer the phone, who want to talk to the press or whatever it is. And those people might be more one way than another, and you won't get a realistic sample of the population. So if C is right, that would mean E is wrong. Why? Well, there could be some confusion, although we don't necessarily know which way the confusion could go. But if we know there was a discrepancy, we could say, sure, maybe just some people overstated it. The problem with some is that some is extremely vague. Some means more than zero. And so by itself, the word some doesn't tell us much. Whereas if I say in general, people in one group are more likely to be in my survey than another group, that tells me a lot. That explains it much better. Because sure, maybe a few people got confused about what election I meant, but maybe not very many. So it doesn't necessarily tell me that much, whereas C necessarily tells me quite a lot. Okay. So the idea of this question is a discrepancy question, and not every CR question is going to be about a discrepancy exactly. But I think it has a lot of relevance for the about kind of weekend questions we're about to do. And the relevance is that if I can get good at spotting and thinking about or explaining discrepancies, I can see how an argument could fail, right? Think of a really simple example, right? What if I said, my company can make a drug that works 30% better than the leading brand and costs half as much to make. Okay, that sounds great. So what's my actual conclusion? well, maybe a conclusion is, so we ought to see great profits on this drug. This makes our stock a strong buy. So notice I'm making now two predictions layered on one another. First, we're going to see profits. Second, hey, buy our stock. That's going to be a good idea to do. So we can attack at either of these points. We could say, well, wait a minute. There could be a discrepancy here between being able to make an effective drug cheaply and having a lot of profits. Maybe something's going to cut into your profits. Someone else will do it even cheaper. There'll be a problem with the drug. You won't be able to sell it in a lot of places. Maybe getting the word out of the drug will be expensive. So it won't cost much to make, but it'll cost a lot to package and market and distribute and all those things, right? So maybe I won't see profits. And then even if I see profits, you could say, hey, what if it turned out that we had great profits, but our stock wasn't a good buy? What could have happened? Well, maybe there are other products in our portfolio that weren't so profitable. Maybe the entire market tanked and all pharmaceuticals were down, right? Maybe the condition that this drug treats has become less prevalent. That's good for the world, maybe not so good for our profits, right? So there's all these different reasons that my premises could be true. I have this ability to make this great drug, but my conclusions might be false. And so really every time we're dealing with an assumption family question, strengthen, weaken, assumption, evaluate the argument, what we're really doing is saying, how could there be a discrepancy between the facts that we have and the opinion or the conclusion or prediction that the author is trying to push? How can there be a difference between I can make a good drug cheap and we're going to make a lot of money on this? And so that's really our main task across the majority of critical reasoning questions, because most critical reasoning questions, if they're not a discrepancy like we just saw, are based on some kind of assumption missing from a conclusion-based argument. You'll see other things like inference questions, but this is where the majority is. So let's look at another example. This is going to be a weaken the argument question. And so we're going to want to take a moment just to read the argument and understand what the author thinks is going to happen, so we can see if we can think about why they might be wrong. Right? So take a minute to read this. So this one isn't literally providing a discrepancy because we didn't necessarily know what to expect, but we might be a bit surprised by the results from real life because we know in real life that, hey, smoking is generally considered quite bad for you, right? So we have a study where a bunch of smokers cut their nicotine intake from cigarettes by quite a lot, but it didn't seem to help them, right? The mortality rate wasn't lower. In other words, they died just as frequently as heavier smokers did, and their cardiovascular disease rate was the same. So you might think that those things would improve. You might think that if I cut down my smoking, I would see better cardiovascular results, and that maybe I might live or might die. But as a population, you might see the population of people like me who did that. You might think fewer of us would die in the time of the study. So that's maybe a surprising thing. But then the author has a very specific opinion, or at least the sponsors of the study have a specific opinion, that reducing nicotine doesn't improve one's health. And so there's still a form of discrepancy here that we want to be able to identify, which is what's different about the facts and about the opinion that they're trying to press, because the facts have to be true. The opinion must not be true, or we wouldn't be able to weaken anything. So if you think about the premises, they're saying basically people cut nicotine from cigarettes, by 50%, but there is no drop in mortality and no cardio disease effect, right? And so we're kind of saying, what's going on? The author wants to say, so cutting nicotine doesn't help your health. So thinking in terms of discrepancy, let's assume they're wrong. Let's assume that cutting nicotine does help your health. How could these things be true, but it's still good to cut nicotine? What could they be missing? Any ideas? Oh, okay. So one thing is, what about other health benefits? Um, it's like anything where people are being too single-minded. Let's say you told me about a TV show you really liked and you said, "Oh, you should totally watch it." And I said, "Well, I watched it, but then I checked my bank balance. I don't have any more money. So why did I watch this show?" Whoa, is all you care about money, Dmitry? You're like, I didn't say watching the show would make you rich. I just thought it was a good show. Like, did you not laugh or cry or, enjoy it? Now, that's a really obvious difference, right? Who said anything about money, right? But who says that your health is measured simply by death rate and cardiovascular disease? Maybe there are other health benefits, right? Maybe I could stand up straight. Maybe I have fewer wrinkles. Maybe I'm in less pain, right? There could be a lot of other things going on other than just those two things, right? Um, yeah. Okay. What else? Let's say they didn't find any additional health benefits. In other words, none of that stuff we were talking about happened, and you can't see any difference in health between the two groups. Is there still any reason that it could be that cutting nicotine does help your health, even though we didn't see it? You could kind of think back to our previous example where there was a discrepancy between the group we surveyed and the group who voted. Yeah, it's just one study. Now, the weekend will never say that directly. It'll never say, well, it's just one study. It was a study of 50,000 people, but there might be some difference between who's in the study, right? And everyone else. For instance, let's just say, what if people in Norway have something unusual going on that the rest of us don't? I don't know what that is, right? I would assume that Norwegian, biology is pretty similar to everyone else's, right? But I still could say, well, maybe there's something going on about Norway's health system or their air or their habits or whatever that it doesn't help them, but it might help me. Thinking more broadly, right? What if you find out that most people don't like a certain show? Does that mean you won't like it? Well, no, but you're not most people. Maybe you're different. Maybe it'll appeal to you in a way it didn't appeal to them. So maybe even though it didn't help the people in this study on average, maybe it might help other people, right? So uh, maybe some difference between people in this study and others who cut nicotine. Okay. Any other ideas? Oh, interesting, right? So maybe the smokers in this group smoked so much that 50% is still way too high to help, right? In other words, maybe there's a limit beyond which smoking more or less doesn't matter, but we're not all over that limit. Just for example, let's say people in this study smoked 1,000 cigarettes a day. I don't know if that's possible, but okay. And they cut it to 500. Maybe that's still about as bad as you can get, and it just doesn't matter, right? Whereas if you smoke 20 cigarettes a day and you cut to 10, maybe it does. So it could be something like that, right? Um, it could have to do with the health of the people, right? Maybe their initial health was different from the standard thing. Maybe they were only looking at older people or younger people or whatever it is. And so we'd still have to know they couldn't just say that. They couldn't say the people in the Norwegian study had an average age of 47, whereas the average age of people in the world is different, right? You'd have to say, but why does that matter? They'd have to explain why that mattered. But there could be something like that if it could explain why this result wouldn't be what we'd expect to get if we cut down on smoking. Right. And as you can imagine, there are lots of reasons. So if you do smoke, I'm sure you could find other reasons than this to stop. Um, don't be like my friend years ago who said that smokers live less long, but bike riders live longer. And since he rode a bike, he could expect to live, longer than us still. And I was like, I don't know if it works that way. Plus, what about the study of smoking bike riders? I don't know how long they live, right? Maybe it's worse than either alone. Okay. So let's see what we can get in here. Give me the answers. Same deal. Just I'll throw a poll in. You can see what you got. Okay, I want to suggest that we repoll for a moment because I want to get rid of one answer that we don't want to care about, and it's getting a lot of love. I want to nix that. We don't want C, and this is part of a broad variety of questions that or answers that we could call variation traps. I don't care that they started at different ages and had different intake. In fact, I might even like that because it implies that there's some diversity of the study group. And it's not just one kind of person that didn't approve, all sorts of people didn't approve. But in general, be very, very wary of answers that just say, hey, there were some differences, right? Like what if I said, usually more people support the president in an initial election than during a midterm election or something like that, right? Can you explain that or weaken it by saying people have different reasons to support the president? Okay, they have different reasons, but why does their level of support change? Why do some people go from supporting to not supporting? Knowing they have different reasons doesn't tell me what's going on. So difference here doesn't matter. So I'm going to repoll. If you polled C, pick something else. How about that? Okay. No one liked D, which is interesting. I kind of like D. I'm not going to say it's right, but I kind of like it in one sense because it seems like, well, hey, reducing nicotine can improve your health if you reduce it entirely. But wait a second, does that really tell us whether just reducing helps, right? So maybe they'd say, sure, yeah, if you don't smoke at all, but I assumed that a lower level would still be helpful. So this doesn't really address that very well. So that's why I get rid of D, although I guess technically, you could say if you quit smoking, you are reducing your nicotine intake, right? It's not that one. E is in some ways like C. It's talk about a different kind of smoking. But we still would want to try to figure out whether it's really true that cutting down cigarettes in itself makes a difference. So sure, we didn't study the people who smoked pipes and cigars, but still couldn't use these cigarette smokers as a stand-in and say, all right, for people who smoke pipes and for people who smoke cigarettes, which is I think what most people smoke if they smoke, it seems like cutting 50% didn't matter. So is there some way that it still does? Right. And this doesn't tell us anything about that. It also doesn't tell us whether people who smoke pipes and cigars have the same result or a different result. It would be a little bit more interesting if it said people who smoke pipes and cigars and cut down by 50% actually do much better. And then you can say, oh, at least for those nicotine users, it's a helpful thing. Okay. That leaves us with A and B. B is interesting because it talks about dining in restaurants. And I want to think about that because certainly if I'm still getting exposed to smoke, then maybe that's the problem. Maybe I thought that I was going to improve by cutting down on cigarettes, but if I'm still getting exposed to smoke from something else, then that could cause my health problems, right? But not a lot of people chose this one. Can you see a flaw in this? What's wrong with objecting that people go to restaurants? If we're trying to say, see, they really would have benefited if they had cut back, we'd have to ask, did they increase this? Did they increase their restaurant visits enough to make up for the drop in smoking? And I would imagine they didn't, but the point is I don't know, right? In other words, it just says that they go to restaurants, but it doesn't say that they started going to restaurants once they cut down on smoking, right? Is it the kind of thing of I used to smoke after work, but instead now I go to a restaurant? then maybe that's interesting because if I'm getting just as much smoke from the restaurant as I was before, um, that could weaken the argument. But I don't know that. I don't know that they're going that much more, and I don't know that secondhand smoke is causing as much damage as firsthand smoke. So I don't know enough to use that one. Whereas A is kind of a sneaky one. Was anyone put off because they thought, but isn't nicotine gum better? Like, if you have to choose between smoking and chewing nicotine gum, wouldn't you rather have people chewing nicotine gum? I thought the whole point was that that was better for you, and maybe it is, right? So this is kind of a weird answer in one sense, because you might say, well, why would they have just as much uh, cardiovascular disease and stuff if they're not actually smoking, if they're just chewing gum? Does chewing the gum mess up your lungs? But the reason this still counts as a weaken is it's suggesting that they didn't actually cut nicotine by 50%, just smoking. So we don't know whether cutting nicotine helps because they didn't really do it, right? It would be like if instead of quitting drinking, I just quit drinking at home, right? Okay, well, that's not the same thing, right? Um, or instead of uh, cutting down on my work overall, I just cut down my work at my current job and I just took a second job or something like that to replace that. That's not the same thing. And so I'd have to say, do we really know what happens if you cut your nicotine by 50%? We don't, because these people didn't do that. They replaced it with something else. So it's kind of a funny answer because I would still want to know why the cardiovascular disease and all that didn't improve. I would have thought the gum would help. But at the same time, we can still knock down their point about reducing nicotine intake because these people didn't reduce their nicotine intake. So sneaky. And this is a really good example of something else um, that I might not think of simply because I wouldn't see why it would matter to my conclusion. But if we're trying to talk about something that A tells us didn't actually occur, they didn't actually reduce our nicotine intake, then we can't come to the kind of conclusion that these sponsors are trying to come to. Tricky, tricky. Okay. Let's try something a little different now. On this next one, they're going to ask kind of a variation that you're likely to see at some point. And some people misinterpret a little bit. So I want to make sure we're cool on just the question itself. So I'm going to show you only the question, not even going to show you the argument itself, the prompt, just for a moment. So they say each of the following, if true, would weaken the conclusion above except. So if they say weaken except, what do we actually want in an answer? Possibly, possibly a strengthen. What else could it be? So the four wrong answers will all weaken. The one right answer will strengthen or do nothing. It could be a neutral, irrelevant statement, right? So on that last argument, for instance, if one of the answers had said, some kids like to play with toy cigarettes, you would just be like, huh? But what does that have to do with whether cutting down on smoking or nicotine helps you? Doesn't. It has nothing to do with it at all. It's a totally irrelevant statement. That would be the answer on a weaken except, because you'd say, yep, that didn't weaken. So it might do nothing at all. Right. Now, usually it'll look at least kind of relevant. It wouldn't be something truly silly, but sometimes people get thrown by that because they're expecting a strengthen, and the answer isn't necessarily a strengthen. It's just something that doesn't weaken. Okay, so let's see what our argument looks like. Take a minute to read that. Okay, so notice again, if you compare the premises they give us to the conclusion they come to, we can think of this in terms of a discrepancy, because we can say that art bidders are often discrete or anonymous. So that's about art bidders. But then the conclusion's about art itself, right? They're saying we don't know where most of the valuable art is, the most valuable art. So they're going from people who bid on art to the status of the most valuable art. So there's a difference between people and art, and there's a difference between art in general and value of the art, right? The most valuable art. Okay. So we can understand why we'd say so. If I can go bid on, a Van Gogh or something like that, and I can, whatever, pay tens of millions of dollars for it, and no one knows who I am, you could see why you'd think that most of the valuable artwork, we don't know where it is, because maybe I take it off to my island somewhere. You don't know who I am. But what could be wrong with this? Why might it turn out that we do know where the art is? So think of that in terms of a discrepancy. Let's say, hey, all these people are bidding anonymously, but it turns out we do know where the art is. Why might it be that we do know where most of the valuable works are, even though people can bid anonymously and even though people are pretty discreet? Any ideas? For instance, maybe investigators find out where the works are. Or maybe people display them in their homes and word gets out, right? I would assume if I bought a Van Gogh, I'd probably show it to somebody. um, and otherwise, why'd I buy it? I just want to sit and stare at it myself in my room, maybe, right? And then maybe that person tells somebody, that person tells somebody, and then it becomes pretty well known. Oh yeah, Dmitry, he's got that Van Gogh. Yeah, Manhattan Prep is paying me that kind of money. Buy original Van Goghs kind of money. You might be surprised how profitable teaching free prep hours really is if you dig into the seamy underbelly of test prep. Okay. Um, any other ideas about why it might be that we would know where the artworks are? I want to think of a fair number in this case because there's going to be 4 answers that all work. It's only one that doesn't. Why else might we know who has the Mona Lisa, you know, the one with his bandaged ear, right? Hmm. Well, let's dig in and find out. But keep in mind that the right answer will be one that doesn't weaken the argument, and all the rest will weaken the argument. So if you find one that weakens the argument, that ain't what you want. Okay, let me move this note. As usual, pull in what you got, but here you're pulling in the one that doesn't weaken. Okay. If you're not sure, go ahead and put in an answer. Let's see what we can do. So a little more action on the top end. So just for fun, I'm gonna start from the bottom. Really doesn't matter where you start. Some people think there is a great strategy there. I'm not sure there really is. So you can start where you want. Often we're making a first pass and a second pass anyway. But if I go to the bottom, the private collections of most serious individual art collectors are often displayed in public settings. Well, hey, we kind of talked about that, right? There's a way people would know. So it weakens because it's saying, hey, they're publicizing where their stuff is. Okay. What I'll often do also is I'll write down A, B, C, D, E on my paper and I'll mark next to them W, W, W. So that way I know the one that doesn't weaken is the one I choose, because it's surprisingly common that people lose track in midstream of what they're trying to do and which answer they want, and it's really easy to do that. So stuff to watch. Okay, so there's a weaken. D is kind of weird, and I could see that being a non-weakening because it's talking about how many people are serious art collectors. So I might just say, I don't care how serious they are. I'll hold up on that. Museums owe the vast majority of the world's most valuable artwork. Okay, well, why do I care about that? Could it matter that most of the works are in museums? If the idea is that when some billionaire oligarch buys a painting, they don't say who they are, but when, the, Museum of Modern Art or something buys a painting, they do. Then this would say, hey, then we will know what they are, where they are, right? If museums are the ones buying, or if they just hold most of them already, then we know where they are. It's not a secret. Okay, so I'd get rid of C. B is interesting because it brings up this idea of serious art collectors again. So I'd have to think about that. I sort of dismissed serious art collectors in D. I didn't cross it out. But I didn't say it's the answer. I was just like, does that matter? So let's talk about serious art collectors again. So is there a reason for me to be talking about serious art collectors? What do I know about serious art collectors? If I go back to the argument, it says serious art collectors are discreet, right? The ones who are serious, uh, do I know who they are though? Right? It says serious individual art collectors are usually discreet, and they place anonymous bids. So the kind of people we're talking about are actually the ones, sure, maybe we've heard of them, but we don't know who has what art if this is what's going on. So what they're describing is about serious collectors, right? So I have to go, oh, serious collectors are the exact group that they're talking about. And in fact, if you look at the way this plays out, it says serious collectors and it says these collectors. And you often see this kind of borrowed language or repeated language on the GMAT, both in reading comp and CR, and to some extent even in sentence correction if you're still dealing with sentence correction in your version of the GMAT. So when you see that serious collectors, and then it says these collectors, that still means serious collectors. So they're saying among the serious collectors, it's normal to be secretive. Therefore, most of the valuable artworks are unknown. Now, if I look back at D, most of these people aren't serious collectors. So then we don't know if they're secretive. So yeah, maybe there's like a handful of really like crazy art geeks who want to like hide their purchases and that's their whole life and they're the serious collectors. But maybe, most art is in the hands of just random well-off people who buy a couple paintings and make no secret of it. Right? So this is a weekend because the secrecy bit was only talking about serious collectors. Right. And that's in some ways just like the sampling thing we talked about it right at the beginning. We're saying that if I'm looking at people who answer phone surveys and try to determine how respective that is of voting in general, I'd have to say, wait, what if people who answer phone surveys are more likely to be voters than others? Same thing with the Democratic Convention. if I'm talking to people at the Democratic convention and trying to then generalize about how voters in general are going to go, maybe that's a mistake. Not all voters are Democrats, right? So if I'm talking about what serious art collectors do, and then just trying to generalize about what people do in general when they buy art, and maybe that's a mistake, right? Maybe I can't do that. And so that becomes a weekend. So then I'll look at B, and this says serious art collectors, the people who they did say are secretive, usually publicize their purchases. Well, we kind of talked about that too, right? We talked about the idea that if I publicize my purchases, then it will no longer be a secret. So B is also a weekend. They're going public. That leaves us with only A. And A is the kind of thing that you might get into about definitions. Well, they say most valuable, but how do we know what the most valuable works are? And that's a really good point. We don't, right? First off, I'm assuming when they say most valuable, they mean worth the most money, right? And that's not entirely subjective. You could see the prices of things, but it could be a bit because you might say, well, I don't know, I have some painting that's been in my home for 100 years. How much is it worth? It depends on what people are willing to pay, and we don't know yet, and blah, 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 blah. It's do people like it? Am I able to convince people it's valuable? But let's say we agree that it's true, that value is subjective, that it's not just a number you could look up or anything like that. But that doesn't tell us the status of those valuable artworks. Okay, so maybe it turns out that the works that Van Gogh's works are not the most valuable, it's something else. Okay, but I'm still trying to figure out if those works, whatever they are secret. And notice that although the conclusion is about valuable artwork, the premises aren't. They're just talking about purchases for their collections or major artworks. And even that was just an example. So they've said in general that these art buyers are secretive. So knowing which art works are valuable doesn't, or knowing that I'm not sure which works are valuable doesn't tell me whether once I find them, they're unknown or not. So this one just doesn't matter. It's not a strengthen. It's not a weaken, and that's one thing to get used to with weaken accept, that something that doesn't do anything is then a good answer. So to rephrase the problem with A, or the reason A doesn't weaken, and so therefore is the answer. It's that even if I agree that we don't know which works are the most valuable, that doesn't tell me whether or not the author is right about the most valuable works being unknown. It doesn't help break that connection between buyers are secretive, so we don't know where the stuff is. Okay, maybe I think Van Goghs are the most important or valuable, and you think, classical architecture is the most important or valuable. Okay, cool. But still, do we know where that stuff is? That we don't know. That's not affected by this. Okay. Yeah, exactly, right. So A doesn't strengthen or weaken it, and that's why I bugged you about it at the beginning, right? If we just think we're looking for a strengthen, we're going to get turned around. We want to be ready to strengthen or do nothing, right? So today we focus entirely on questions that were weakening, but you could expand this to talk about questions that are an assumption or strengthen or discrepancy. Often an assumption will just be, hey, you're assuming this thing doesn't go wrong, right? So I could turn a lot of these into another kind of question, right? For instance, if they said, what is this author assuming? You could say, hey, they're assuming that art collectors don't publicize their purchases later, or you're assuming that museums don't own the vast majority of the world's most valuable artwork. So often the way to construct a good assumption answer, it's not the only way, but one of the ways, is to negate or neutralize one of these kind of discrepancy objections we've been making. Similarly with a strengthen then. I can strengthen an argument by saying, oh, the people who answer phone surveys aren't any different from the rest of the population, right? They're just as likely to vote as everyone else, right? People at the Democratic convention actually are representative of the voting public, right? There's, actually surprisingly a ton of Republicans there, and it's really pretty balanced. And okay, that would be surprising, but if it were true, then it would be fine to poll them, right? If they were really representative. Okay. So that's often where a strengthen or assumption comes in, and evaluate just turns into a question. What do I need to know? Do art collectors publicize their artwork purchases later? Do museums own the vast majority? Is there any difference between people who answer phone surveys and people who don't in terms of their voting? Okay. I will stop there. Hope that was helpful to you. Just in this idea that people often have that, hey, I am supposed to be able to predict the exact answer. As you saw in most of these, we didn't, for the most part, predict the exact answer, but we want to predict enough that we're more likely to recognize the answer when we see it. So it's worth spending some time on thinking about. If you want to check out any of our courses, you can always check out the first session for free. We'd love to see it in there. Stick around if you have any questions for me. Otherwise, I wish you all the best of luck with your GMAT endeavors, and have a great time. See ya.